Stone walls rising without mortar, without arches, without any of the engineering tricks that Europeans assumed were necessary to build something that would last centuries. When Portuguese traders first heard rumors of a vast stone city deep in the African interior, they refused to believe Africans had built it. That single act of disbelief would distort the history of an entire civilization for 400 years. Who actually built Great Zimbabwe? Why did they build it? And what does the answer reveal about the assumptions that have shaped how we understand African history? If this kind of serious, evidence-based history matters to you, please subscribe to our channel, like this video and leave a comment below. It genuinely helps us keep producing work like this and helps other viewers who care about real history find it. What follows is the full story of one of the most remarkable civilizations in the history of the African continent. You will follow a society from its earliest farming villages to the height of a trading empire that connected the interior of southern Africa to the coasts of the Indian Ocean, to Arabia, Persia, and China. You will watch a ruling class rise on the power of cattle and gold, build a capital that still astonishes engineers today, and then face the slow, grinding pressures that brought it down. You will encounter the colonial scholars who tried to erase this civilization from the historical record and the African scholars and researchers who fought to restore it. And at the end, you will understand something about how civilizations are remembered, who gets to tell their story, and what happens when the answer to a historical question becomes politically inconvenient. To understand Great Zimbabwe, you need to understand the landscape it was born from. The site sits on a granite plateau in what is today the country of Zimbabwe, at an elevation of roughly 1,100 meters above sea level. The plateau is well watered, with reliable rainfall, good grazing land, and forests that provided timber and fuel. Below the plateau, the land drops toward the Limpopo River Valley to the south and the Zambezi River Valley to the north. Between these two great rivers, the plateau offered something rare in southern Africa, a place where cattle could thrive without the Tsetse fly that devastated livestock in the lower, hotter zones. Cattle were the foundation of everything. In the political economy of southern Africa across many centuries, cattle were not simply food. They were wealth made visible, a medium of exchange, a form of social insurance, and a source of political power. A man who controlled large herds could attract followers, forge alliances through the gift of animals, and build the kind of loyalty networks that translated into authority. The people who would eventually build Great Zimbabwe understood this deeply. Their civilization was, at its core, built on the power of cattle, amplified over time by the power of gold. The earliest human presence in the region of Great Zimbabwe goes back many thousands of years to hunter-gatherer communities who left their mark in rock paintings scattered across the granite outcrops of the plateau. But the story of the civilization that built the stone enclosures begins much later, with the spread of farming and herding communities across southern Africa in the first millennium of the Common Era. Bantu-speaking agricultural communities had been moving southward and eastward across the African continent for centuries, carrying with them knowledge of iron smelting, crop cultivation, and cattle herding. By around the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era, farming villages had become established across the Zimbabwe plateau. These were not yet the builders of stone walls. They lived in pole and dagger structures, a kind of mud-plastered wattle construction common across the region, but they were laying the agricultural and social foundations on which something larger would eventually grow. The site of Great Zimbabwe itself shows evidence of occupation from roughly the 4th century of the Common Era, though the major stone construction began much later. Early inhabitants chose the site for practical reasons. The granite kopjes, the rounded rocky hills that rise from the plateau, offered natural defensive positions. The surrounding land was fertile, water was accessible, and the location sat at a useful crossroads between the interior plateau and the routes that led toward the coast. For several centuries, the settlement at Great Zimbabwe was one of many across the plateau. What made it different was not yet visible. The transformation that would turn this site into the capital of a regional power came gradually, driven by a combination of geography, trade, and political skill. By around the 9th and 10th centuries of the Common Era, the Indian Ocean trade network was pulling goods from deep in the African interior toward the coast. Swahili trading towns on the East African coast, places like Kilwa and Sofala, were acting as intermediaries between African interior traders and merchants from Arabia, Persia, India, and eventually China. The goods flowing out from the interior included ivory, animal skins, and above all, gold. The Zimbabwe Plateau sat on some of the richest gold-bearing geology in southern Africa. Controlling access to that gold, or controlling the trade routes that moved it toward the coast, was a path to extraordinary wealth and power. The society that would build Great Zimbabwe was not the first to benefit from this trade. An earlier center of power on the plateau, at a site called Mapungubwe in the Limpopo Valley, had already established itself as a significant node in the Indian Ocean trading network by around the 11th century of the Common Era. Mapungubwe was a stratified society with a clear ruling elite, evidenced by the famous golden rhinoceros figurine and other gold objects found in elite burials on the hilltop. The rulers of Mapungubwe had understood that controlling gold trade meant controlling political power, and they had built a society organized around that principle. But Mapungubwe declined. The reasons are debated, but climate change likely played a role. Cooling and drying trend in the 13th century would have reduced agricultural productivity in the Limpopo Valley, making the higher, better-watered Zimbabwe plateau more attractive. Political shifts in the trade network may also have played a part. Whatever the precise combination of causes, the center of gravity on the plateau shifted northward toward the site of Great Zimbabwe. By around 1250 Common Era, Great Zimbabwe was emerging as the dominant political center of the region. The people who built Great Zimbabwe are identified by scholars as the ancestors of the Shona people, the largest ethnic group in present-day Zimbabwe. The specific political community that built and ruled from Great Zimbabwe is often associated with the Karanga, a Shona-speaking group. Their rulers held a title that would echo through centuries of southern African political history, Mambo, meaning king or ruler. Later traditions would associate the rulers of Great Zimbabwe with a dynasty or lineage connected to the broader Shona concept of sacred kingship. The construction of the stone enclosures at Great Zimbabwe was not the work of a single ruler or a single generation. It was an accumulation over roughly 2 centuries from around 1250 to around 1450 Common Era. Different phases of construction reflect different periods of wealth, ambition, and political confidence. The site is divided by scholars into 3 main architectural zones. The hill complex sits on the granite kopje that dominates the landscape. This was probably the oldest occupied area, and it served as a place of spiritual and political authority, a place where the ruler performed rituals, communicated with ancestors, and demonstrated sacred power. The valley ruins spread across the lower ground between the hill and the great enclosure and represent the residential and functional areas of the city. And then there is the great enclosure, the most famous and most impressive structure, a massive oval wall of dry stone masonry that stands as one of the most remarkable architectural achievements in sub-Saharan African history. The great enclosure is worth pausing on because its construction is genuinely extraordinary. The outer wall is roughly 250 meters in circumference. At its highest point, it stands about 11 meters tall. At its base, the wall is up to 5 meters thick. The entire structure was built without mortar. The builders used a technique of careful stone selection and precise placement, fitting granite blocks together so tightly and so skillfully that the walls have survived for centuries without the binding agent that most people assume is necessary for stone construction. The granite used was not quarried from distant sources. The builders exploited the natural property of granite in this region, which fractures along relatively flat plains when heated and cooled rapidly, to produce usable blocks from the local copies. They were working with the geology of their own landscape. Inside the great enclosure, the most striking internal feature is the conical tower, a solid tower of granite blocks roughly 9 meters tall and about 5.5 meters in diameter at the base. It serves no obvious defensive or residential function. It is solid throughout, with no interior space. Scholars have debated its meaning for generations. The most widely accepted interpretation is that it was a symbolic structure, perhaps representing a grain bin, a symbol of agricultural abundance and the ruler's responsibility to feed his people. Some scholars have connected it to ancestor veneration practices. The honest answer is that its precise symbolic meaning remains uncertain, because no written records from the builders themselves survive. That absence of written records is one of the central challenges of Great Zimbabwe's history. The civilization that built it did not use writing. Everything we know comes from archaeology, from oral traditions recorded much later, from the accounts of external traders and travelers, and from the careful interpretation of material evidence. This means that many questions about the internal political life of Great Zimbabwe, the names of its rulers, the specifics of its religious practice, and the details of its social organization remain genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is the scale of the city at its height. Estimates of the population of Great Zimbabwe at its peak, roughly in the 14th and early 15th centuries of the Common Era, range from 10,000 to 18,000 people. This made it one of the largest urban settlements in sub-Saharan Africa at the time. The stone enclosures were not the entire city. They were the monumental core, the royal and ritual center. Around them spread a much larger area of pole and dagger housing, agricultural land, and the infrastructure of a functioning city. The economy that supported this population was complex and multi-layered. Cattle herding remained central. The ruling elite controlled large herds, and cattle continued to function as the primary form of wealth and social currency within the Plateau society. But gold trade was the engine of external power. Archaeological excavations at Great Zimbabwe have uncovered gold objects, gold working tools, and crucially, large quantities of imported goods, glass beads from India and the Middle East, Chinese porcelain, Persian faience. These objects are the material fingerprints of the Indian Ocean Trade Network, and they confirm that Great Zimbabwe was plugged into one of the most extensive commercial systems in the medieval world. The gold did not come primarily from Great Zimbabwe itself. The city controlled and taxed the flow of gold from mining communities across the plateau. Small-scale gold workings were scattered across the region, and the political authority of the Mambo at Great Zimbabwe allowed the ruling class to extract tribute from these producers and to direct the gold toward the coastal trade routes. Ivory followed a similar pattern. The city was, in economic terms, a redistribution center and a political authority that made long-distance trade possible by providing security, infrastructure, and a stable political framework. The trade route from Great Zimbabwe to the coast ran roughly eastward toward the port of Sofala, on the coast of what is today Mozambique. Sofala was the key intermediary port for the gold trade of the Zimbabwe Plateau. From Sofala, goods moved north along the coast to the great Swahili trading city of Kilwa, which by the 14th century had become one of the wealthiest cities in the entire Indian Ocean world. The Arab traveler Ibn Battuta, who visited Kilwa in 1331 Common Era, described it as one of the most beautiful cities in the world and noted its great wealth. That wealth was built in significant part on the gold that flowed from the Zimbabwe Plateau through Sofala to Kilwa, and then out across the ocean. The political structure of Great Zimbabwe was built around the concept of sacred kingship. The Mambo was not simply a political leader. He was a ritual specialist, a mediator between the living and the ancestors, and a figure whose personal well-being was understood to be connected to the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the people. This kind of sacred authority was common across many African political systems, and it served important functions. It raised the ruler above ordinary political competition, made challenges to his authority into something close to religious transgression, and gave him a monopoly on certain ritual functions that reinforced his power. The physical layout of Great Zimbabwe expressed this political theology in stone. The hill complex, with its commanding view over the surrounding landscape, was the ruler's ritual space. The great enclosure below may have been associated with the Queen Mother or with royal wives, though this interpretation is debated. The spatial separation between the sacred hilltop and the lower enclosures reflected a social hierarchy that was carefully maintained and expressed through architecture. The ruling class at Great Zimbabwe also controlled access to prestige goods. The glass beads, the porcelain, the imported cloth that came through the trade network were not distributed equally. They were concentrated in the hands of the elite, and their possessions signaled status. This is visible in the archaeological record. The density of imported goods found in the Great Enclosure and the hill complex is far higher than in the surrounding residential areas. The rulers were using their control of trade to maintain social distance from their subjects and to demonstrate their unique connection to the wider world. By the late 14th century of the Common Era, Great Zimbabwe was at or near the peak of its power. Its authority extended across a substantial portion of the Zimbabwe Plateau, and its influence reached into the trade networks of the Indian Ocean. The stone walls were being added to and refined. The city was full, busy, and wealthy. And then the pressures that would eventually bring it down began to accumulate. The first pressure was environmental. A city of 10,000 to 18,000 people places enormous demands on its local landscape. The cattle herds required grazing land. The population required agricultural land and firewood. Over generations, the area around Great Zimbabwe was likely subjected to significant deforestation and soil degradation. The carrying capacity of the local environment was being stretched. This is not speculation, It is a pattern that researchers have identified at many pre-industrial urban centers, and the evidence from the Great Zimbabwe region is consistent with this kind of environmental pressure building over time. The second pressure was political. The very success of Great Zimbabwe had created a political system that depended on the continuous extraction of tribute and the maintenance of authority over distant communities. As the city grew larger and the demands of the ruling class grew more expensive, the burden on subject communities increased. At the same time, the plateau was not a unified political space. There were other powerful lineages, other ambitious leaders, other communities that chafed under the authority of the Mambo at Great Zimbabwe. The third pressure was commercial. The trade routes that fed the city's wealth were not fixed. They could shift, and in the early 15th century of the Common Era, there are signs that the main axis of the gold trade on the Zimbabwe plateau was beginning to move northward toward the Zambezi Valley, where a new political power was rising. This new power was the Mutapa state, sometimes called the Mwene Mutapa state, from the title of its ruler, the Mwene Mutapa, meaning roughly lord of the plundered lands or master pillager, though the precise translation is debated. The founder of the Mutapa state is identified in later oral traditions as Nyatsimba Mutota, a figure from the Zimbabwe plateau who led a movement northward toward the Zambezi Valley in the early to mid-15th century of the Common Era. The traditions say he was searching for salt and new grazing lands. Whatever the precise motivation, the movement northward represented a fundamental shift in the political geography of the plateau. The relationship between the Mutapa state and Great Zimbabwe is not entirely clear. Some traditions suggest that Mutota was himself connected to the ruling lineage of Great Zimbabwe, perhaps a prince or a subordinate chief who broke away. Others frame it as a more independent development. What is clear is that by around 1450 Common Era, the political and commercial energy of the plateau was shifting away from Great Zimbabwe and toward the new Mutapa center in the north. Great Zimbabwe did not fall in a single dramatic collapse. It was not burned, sacked, or conquered in a way that left a clear archaeological signature. Instead, it experienced a gradual decline, a slow withdrawal of population, wealth, and political authority over several decades. The city was not abandoned all at once. People continued to live there, but in smaller numbers and with less access to the imported goods that had once flowed through the royal enclosures. The stone walls were no longer being built or maintained with the same care. The city was becoming a shadow of what it had been. By around 1450 to 1480 Common Era, Great Zimbabwe had effectively ceased to function as a major political capital. It retained significance as a sacred site, a place associated with powerful ancestors and with the memory of past greatness. But the living center of power on the plateau had moved elsewhere. This is the point in the story where the history of Great Zimbabwe splits into two parallel tracks. One track follows what happened to the political civilization that had built it, the successor states and the transformations of Shona political culture in the centuries that followed. The other track follows the history of the site itself, and the extraordinary, disturbing story of how Europeans encountered it, refused to understand it, and tried to write it out of African history. Let us follow the first track briefly. The Mutapa state, based in the Zambezi Valley, became the dominant power of the Plateau region through the 15th and 16th centuries of the Common Era. It maintained trading relationships with the Swahili coast and, after the Portuguese arrived in the Indian Ocean in the early 16th century, with Portuguese merchants and eventually Portuguese colonial agents. The Portuguese were deeply interested in the gold of the plateau, and they spent considerable energy trying to gain direct access to the sources, bypassing the Swahili and Arab intermediaries who had previously controlled the coastal trade. The Portuguese relationship with the Mutapa state was complex and often violent. Portuguese traders established themselves at the court of the Mwene Mutapa, converting some rulers to Christianity and intervening in succession disputes. By the 17th century of the Common Era, Portuguese interference had seriously weakened the Mutapa state. A new power, the Rosvi state under the Changamire dynasty, rose to challenge and eventually displace Mutapa authority over much of the plateau in the late 17th century. The Rosvi, under their ruler Changamire Dombo, drove Portuguese traders off the plateau in a series of military campaigns in the 1680s of the Common Era. The Rosvi state is significant for the history of Great Zimbabwe because the Rosvi reoccupied the site and used it as a ritual center. They did not rebuild the stone walls on the scale of the original civilization, but they maintained the site's sacred significance and added some construction of their own. For the Rosvi, Great Zimbabwe was a place of ancestral power, a connection to the deep past of the plateau civilization. This continued use of the site as a sacred space lasted until the political disruptions of the early 19th century, when the upheavals associated with the Mfikane, the great movement of peoples across southern Africa, triggered in part by the rise of the Zulu kingdom, reached the Plateau and scattered the Rosvi state. Now let us follow the second track, the story of European encounter with Great Zimbabwe, because this story is in some ways as historically important as the original civilization itself. Portuguese traders and missionaries in the 16th and 17th centuries heard reports of stone ruins in the interior. Some of these accounts made their way into Portuguese colonial records, but direct European contact with the ruins of Great Zimbabwe came only in the 19th century, as European explorers and hunters penetrated the interior of southern Africa. The first European to visit and document Great Zimbabwe was the German geologist Karl Mauch, who reached the site in September of 1871 Common Era. Mauch was not a neutral observer. He arrived with a set of assumptions shaped by European racial ideology of the 19th century, assumptions that held that sub-Saharan Africans were incapable of constructing monumental architecture. When he saw the stone walls, he concluded immediately that they could not have been built by African people. He proposed instead that Great Zimbabwe was the work of Phoenicians, or perhaps that it was the biblical land of Ophir, the source of King Solomon's gold mentioned in the Hebrew Scriptures. Mauch's interpretation was not based on evidence, it was based on prejudice. But it proved extraordinarily influential because it fit perfectly with the ideological needs of European colonialism in southern Africa. If Great Zimbabwe had been built by Africans, it was evidence that African civilizations were capable of sophisticated political organization, monumental architecture, and long-distance trade. That evidence was deeply inconvenient for a colonial project that justified itself partly on the claim that Africans had no history, no civilization, and therefore no claim to their own land. The colonial state of Rhodesia, established by Cecil Rhodes's British South Africa Company in the 1890s of the Common Era, made the denial of African authorship of Great Zimbabwe into something close to official policy. Rhodes himself visited the site and was captivated by it. He promoted the Phoenician or Semitic origin theory enthusiastically because it allowed him to claim that the ruins were evidence of an ancient non-African civilization, one that could be appropriated as part of a European colonial heritage. The name Zimbabwe was even used in colonial promotional literature to suggest that Rhodesia was the land of ancient Ophir, a place of fabulous wealth waiting to be reclaimed by European enterprise. The political stakes of the question were made explicit in the career of Richard Nicklin Hall, who was appointed as the curator of Great Zimbabwe by the Rhodesian colonial administration in 1902 Common Era. Hall was not a trained archaeologist. He was a journalist and a committed advocate of the non-African origin theory. In the 3 years he managed the site, he caused catastrophic damage to the archaeological record. He removed what he called the filth and decadence of the Kafir occupation, which in practice meant digging out and discarding enormous quantities of archaeological material from the interior of the enclosures, material that would have been invaluable for understanding the site's history. His excavations were not scientific, they were ideologically motivated destruction. The scientific refutation of the non-African origin theory came from a series of careful archaeological investigations, beginning with the work of David Randall Makiva in 1905 Common Era. Randall Makiva, a trained British archaeologist, conducted a systematic examination of the site and concluded clearly and unambiguously that the ruins were of African origin and medieval date. His findings were based on the stratigraphic evidence, the types of artifacts found, and the architectural analysis of the construction techniques. The colonial establishment did not accept his conclusions. Debate continued for decades, with amateur theorists and colonial ideologues continuing to promote Phoenician, Arab, or other non-African origins. The definitive scientific confirmation came from the work of Gertrude Catton Thompson, another British archaeologist who conducted excavations at the site in 1929 Common Era. Catton Thompson was meticulous, rigorous, and thorough. Her conclusion was unequivocal. Great Zimbabwe was built by Bantu-speaking African people, and the construction dated to the medieval period. She published her findings in a major scholarly work and presented them to the British Association for the Advancement of Science, stating directly that every aspect of the ruins, every detail of the artifacts, every piece of evidence pointed to African authorship. The colonial reaction was hostile. Catton Thompson was attacked personally and professionally. Critics accused her of incompetence, of being deceived, of having a political agenda. The Rhodesian colonial government and the settler community that depended on the ideology of African incapacity found her conclusions intolerable. For decades afterward, the official position promoted to tourists visiting Great Zimbabwe in Rhodesia was deliberately vague or misleading about the origins of the site, continuing to hint at non-African builders despite the scientific consensus. This was not a minor academic dispute. It was a politically motivated campaign to suppress historical truth in the service of colonial power. The suppression had real consequences. It denied African people the history of their own civilization. It prevented the integration of Great Zimbabwe into a broader understanding of African history and Indian Ocean trade, and it shaped how generations of people, both inside and outside Africa, understood the capacity of African civilizations. The political resolution came with Zimbabwean independence in 1980 Common Era. The new nation took its name directly from Great Zimbabwe, making the ruins a founding symbol of national identity and sovereignty. The name Zimbabwe itself comes from the Shona phrase, Dzimba dza Mabwe, meaning houses of stone or great stone houses, and the choice of this name for the new nation was a deliberate and powerful act of historical reclamation. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe moved from being a site of colonial confusion and suppression to being the central symbol of an independent African nation. The official guide at Great Zimbabwe in the years immediately after independence was required to tell visitors the truth, that the site was built by African people, the ancestors of the Shona, and that it was the capital of a sophisticated civilization that traded with the medieval world. This was not new information. It had been established scientifically for decades, but stating it clearly and officially in Zimbabwe was a political act as much as a historical one. Now let us return to the deeper history of the civilization itself, and to some of the specific details that make Great Zimbabwe so remarkable as a historical subject. One of the most striking aspects of the site is what the imported objects tell us about the reach of the trading network. Chinese porcelain found at Great Zimbabwe dates primarily to the 14th and early 15th centuries of the Common Era, corresponding to the Yuan and early Ming dynasties in China. This porcelain was not manufactured for the African market. It was high-quality Chinese exportware that had traveled from China across the Indian Ocean to the East African coast and then inland to the Zimbabwe Plateau. The presence of this porcelain at Great Zimbabwe is direct material evidence that the city was connected to one of the longest trade routes in the medieval world. Persian faience beads and glass beads from India tell the same story. The Indian Ocean trading system of the medieval period was not a simple two-way exchange. It was a complex, multi-nodal network connecting East Africa, Arabia, Persia, India, Southeast Asia, and China in a web of commercial relationships. Great Zimbabwe was a node in that network, not a peripheral curiosity, but an active participant whose gold and ivory were genuinely valued commodities in markets thousands of kilometers away. The volume of gold objects found at Great Zimbabwe itself is relatively modest, which initially puzzled researchers. The explanation is that Great Zimbabwe was not primarily a gold-producing site. It was a redistributive center. The gold was processed and traded onward. What stayed at the site were the prestige goods that came back in exchange: the beads, the porcelain, the cloth of which nothing survives. The gold objects found at the site, including wire jewelry, thin sheet gold, and gold-covered wooden objects, represent the portion of the gold that was retained for local use, not the full volume that passed through the city. The soapstone carvings found at Great Zimbabwe are another category of evidence that reveals something important about the civilization's symbolic world. 8 soapstone bird sculptures were found at the site, carved from a soft stone and mounted on tall pedestals. These birds are now iconic. One of them is depicted on the flag of Zimbabwe. They were found in the hill complex, the ritual area of the site, and they clearly had significant symbolic meaning. The most widely accepted interpretation is that they represent the Batur eagle, a bird associated in Shona religious tradition with the spirit world and with communication between the living and the ancestors. If this interpretation is correct, the birds were ritual objects, markers of sacred space, and expressions of the theology of sacred kingship that underpinned the ruler's authority. The colonial era excavations removed these birds from their original contexts in ways that make precise interpretation difficult. Several of the birds were taken out of Zimbabwe entirely during the colonial period, sold or given to private collectors and museums. The return of these objects to Zimbabwe has been a long-running diplomatic and cultural issue. Some have been returned. Others remain outside the country. The architecture of Great Zimbabwe also rewards close attention as evidence of social organization. The dry stone construction technique used at the site is not unique to Great Zimbabwe. It appears at dozens of smaller stone enclosure sites across the Zimbabwe Plateau, sites that range in size from small homesteads to medium-sized settlements. This distribution suggests that the tradition of stone enclosure building was widespread across the plateau, and that Great Zimbabwe was the largest and most elaborate expression of a broader cultural and architectural tradition, not an isolated anomaly. The smaller sites are often called Zimbabwes with a lowercase letter, using the same word that names the great capital. This terminology reflects the fact that the stone enclosure tradition was a regional phenomenon, associated with the Shona-speaking communities of the plateau and with the political and social structures they developed. The great capital was the apex of a system that had many smaller nodes. The hierarchy of these sites reflects the political hierarchy of the society. Smaller Zimbabwes were the residences of subordinate chiefs and local leaders who owed allegiance to the Mambo at the capital. The stone enclosures marked status and authority. They were not primarily defensive structures, though they could serve that function. They were expressions of political legitimacy, markers of the right to rule, built in the most durable material available. This political geography, a central capital connected to a network of subordinate chiefs through ties of tribute, loyalty, and ritual authority, is a pattern found in many African political systems. It was flexible and extensible, capable of incorporating new territories and new communities as the power of the center grew. But it was also fragile in a specific way. If the center lost its ability to project authority, to distribute prestige goods, to perform the rituals that validated the political order, the subordinate chiefs had little reason to remain loyal. This fragility helps explain the nature of the decline of Great Zimbabwe. It was not a sudden collapse triggered by a single catastrophic event. It was a gradual unraveling of the political and economic relationships that held the system together. As the trade routes shifted northward, as the environmental pressures around the capital intensified, as new political centers emerged on the plateau, the Mambo at Great Zimbabwe found it increasingly difficult to maintain the flows of tribute and prestige goods that were the lifeblood of his authority. Chiefs who had been subordinate began to drift away, aligning themselves with new centers of power. The population of the capital, deprived of the economic activity that had sustained it, began to disperse. This pattern of a great center declining not through conquest but through the slow erosion of the relationships that made it great is one of the most common patterns in the history of pre-industrial states. It is a reminder that political power is not a fixed possession. It is a relationship that must be continuously renewed, and when the conditions that made it possible change, the power itself changes with them. The question of what Great Zimbabwe's decline means for the broader history of the region is worth exploring carefully. The civilization that built Great Zimbabwe did not simply disappear. Its political traditions, its religious practices, its architectural knowledge, and its social structures were carried forward by the successor states that emerged on the plateau. The Mutapa state, the Rosvi state, and the various Shona chieftaincies that survived into the 19th century were all heirs to the civilization of Great Zimbabwe, even when they were not physically located at the site. The oral traditions of the Shona people preserve memories of Great Zimbabwe, though these traditions have been filtered through many generations of retelling and are difficult to use as precise historical sources. Some traditions identify the rulers of Great Zimbabwe as ancestors of specific Shona clans. Others frame the site as a place of powerful ancestral spirits, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead is thin. These traditions reflect the long continuity of the site's sacred significance, even after its political importance had faded. The 19th century brought new disruptions to the plateau. The upheavals of the Mfakane, which rippled outward from the Zulu kingdom in the south, sent waves of displaced and militarized groups across southern Africa. The Ndebele, a Nguni-speaking group that had broken away from the Zulu kingdom under their leader Mzilikazi, moved on to the southwestern portion of the Zimbabwe plateau in the 1830s of the Common Era. The Ndebele established a powerful state that dominated the region and frequently raided Shona communities for cattle and captives. The political landscape of the plateau was transformed by this intrusion. Great Zimbabwe itself, already long past its political peak, was not a major target or a major player in these 19th century conflicts, but the disruptions of the period further scattered the communities that had maintained the site's sacred traditions. By the time European explorers arrived in the second half of the 19th century, the site was occupied by a small community but was no longer the center of any significant political or ritual activity. The arrival of Karl Marx in 1871, which we have already discussed, marked the beginning of the colonial encounter with the ruins. But it is worth dwelling on the specific intellectual context of that encounter, because it reveals something important about how European colonial ideology worked. The denial of African authorship of Great Zimbabwe was not simply ignorance or racism in the crude sense. It was a systematic intellectual framework, supported by the racial science of the 19th century, that made it genuinely difficult for many educated Europeans to process the evidence in front of them. The framework held that civilization was a product of certain racial groups, primarily those of European or Semitic origin, and that sub-Saharan Africans were at a lower stage of human development incapable of producing monumental architecture, complex political organization, or long-distance trade. When the evidence of Great Zimbabwe contradicted this framework, the framework was not abandoned. Instead, the evidence was reinterpreted to fit the framework. This is a classic example of what philosophers of science call confirmation bias operating at a civilizational scale. The colonial scholars who promoted non-African origin theories were not, for the most part, consciously lying. They genuinely believed what they said. But their belief was shaped by a prior commitment to a racial hierarchy that made the truth invisible to them. The political consequences of the truth, which would have undermined the ideological justification for colonial rule, reinforced their resistance to accepting it. The scientific refutation of these theories, by Randall McKeever in 1905 and Catton Thompson in 1929, was based on straightforward archaeological evidence. The artifacts found at the site, including the imported goods from the Indian Ocean trade, were consistent with a medieval African date and inconsistent with any Phoenician or ancient Semitic presence. The construction techniques were consistent with known African stone-building traditions. The oral traditions of the local Shona communities consistently identified the site as the work of their own ancestors. All of this evidence pointed in the same direction, and it was ignored or attacked by those with a political interest in maintaining the non-African origin theory. The willingness of the colonial establishment to maintain a demonstrably false historical claim for decades, in the face of clear scientific evidence, is one of the more sobering episodes in the history of archaeology. It demonstrates that historical knowledge is not simply a matter of accumulating evidence. It is also a matter of power. Who has the authority to define what counts as evidence, who has the platform to make their interpretation heard, and who has the political interest in suppressing inconvenient truths. The post-independence history of Great Zimbabwe has its own complications. The site was designated a United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization World Heritage Site in 1986 Common Era, an international recognition of its outstanding universal value. Archaeological research at the site has continued, though it has been complicated by political and economic instability in Zimbabwe, particularly during the difficult years of the late 1990s and early 2000s of the Common Era. The site has suffered from inadequate funding for conservation, from the pressure of tourism, and from the broader challenges facing Zimbabwean institutions during periods of political crisis. Some of the most important recent archaeological work has focused on the hinterland of Great Zimbabwe, the smaller Zimbabwes, and the farming communities that surrounded the capital. This work has helped to fill in the picture of the broader society that supported the city, showing how tribute flowed toward the capital, how agricultural production was organized, and how the environmental pressures of intensive occupation developed over time. Researchers have also used modern techniques including radiocarbon dating, soil analysis, and the study of plant and animal remains to build a more detailed picture of daily life at the site. The results have confirmed and refined the broad chronology established by earlier researchers, while adding new detail about diet, agriculture, craft production, and environmental change. One particularly striking finding from recent research is the evidence for sophisticated water management around the site. The Zimbabwe Plateau receives seasonal rainfall, and managing water storage was important for a large urban population. Evidence for terracing and water control features in the landscape around Great Zimbabwe suggests that the inhabitants were actively managing their agricultural environment, not simply relying on natural rainfall patterns. The goldworking evidence found at the site has also been studied in detail. Crucibles, tuyères, which are the clay nozzles used to direct air into a smelting furnace, and fragments of slag indicate that gold was being refined and worked at the site. The scale of this activity was not industrial in the modern sense, but it was systematic and skilled. The gold workers of Great Zimbabwe were producing objects of considerable technical quality, working with a material that requires precise temperature control and careful handling. The question of gender and social organization at Great Zimbabwe is one that researchers have approached carefully, given the limited evidence. The oral traditions associated with the site suggest that the great enclosure may have been associated with royal women, perhaps the Queen Mother or the ruler's senior wives. If this interpretation is correct, it would indicate that elite women at Great Zimbabwe held significant social status and were spatially separated from the male-dominated ritual space of the hill complex. But the archaeological evidence for this interpretation is indirect, and scholars are appropriately cautious about making strong claims. What is clear is that the society of Great Zimbabwe was hierarchical, and that hierarchy was expressed spatially, architecturally, and through the differential distribution of prestige goods. The ruling class lived differently from the majority of the population, had access to goods that others could not obtain, and performed ritual functions that reinforced their unique status. This is not unusual in pre-industrial states, but the specific forms it took at Great Zimbabwe, the stone enclosures, the soapstone birds, the concentration of Indian Ocean trade goods, were distinctive to this civilization and this place. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe extends beyond the borders of modern Zimbabwe. The stone enclosure tradition spread across a wide area of southern Africa, and related sites have been identified in parts of present-day Mozambique, Botswana, and South Africa. The political and cultural connections between Great Zimbabwe and these wider regions are an active area of research. Understanding Great Zimbabwe in its full regional context, rather than as an isolated phenomenon, is one of the most important tasks facing researchers today. The connection to the Indian Ocean trade network also has a broader significance. For too long, the history of the Indian Ocean was written primarily from the perspective of the maritime trading cities of the coast, the Swahili towns, the Arab and Indian merchant communities. The interior African societies that produced the goods that made the coastal trade possible were treated as passive suppliers rather than active participants. Great Zimbabwe's history challenges this framing. The rulers of the plateau were not passive. They were political agents who organized production, controlled trade routes, managed relationships with coastal intermediaries, and used the proceeds of trade to build a sophisticated urban civilization. They were participants in the Indian Ocean world, not simply its suppliers. This reframing has implications for how we understand the history of globalization itself. The Indian Ocean trading system of the medieval period was one of the most extensive commercial networks in human history, connecting societies from East Africa to China in relationships of exchange that shaped cultures, economies, and political systems across a vast region. Great Zimbabwe was part of that story. Its gold helped fund the prosperity of Kilwa. Its rulers received Chinese porcelain and Indian glass. Its civilization was shaped by its participation in a global network, just as it shaped that network in return. The story of Great Zimbabwe is also a story about the relationship between material culture and political power. The stone walls were not built because stone was the most practical building material. Pole and dagger construction was cheaper, faster, and adequate for most purposes. Stone was chosen because it was permanent, because it was visually impressive, because it communicated permanence and power in a way that mud walls could not. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe were making a statement in stone, and that statement has lasted for 700 years after their city's decline. This is perhaps the deepest irony of the colonial encounter with Great Zimbabwe. The statement that the builders made in stone was so powerful, so obviously the work of skilled and organized human beings, that it forced the colonial ideologues into increasingly desperate theoretical contortions to deny its African authorship. The walls themselves refused to be silenced. They stood there, undeniable, demanding an explanation, and the explanation that the evidence demanded, that African people had built something extraordinary, was precisely the explanation that colonial ideology could not accept. The eventual acceptance of that explanation, first in scientific literature and then in public discourse and national symbolism, was not simply a victory for historical accuracy. It was a demonstration that evidence patiently gathered and carefully interpreted can ultimately prevail over ideology, even when ideology has the power of a colonial state behind it. It took decades longer than it should have. The damage done by the colonial suppression of this history, to the people whose history it is, to the broader understanding of African civilization, and to the integrity of historical scholarship, was real and lasting. But the truth did prevail. Today, Great Zimbabwe stands as one of the most important archaeological sites in Africa. It draws researchers from around the world and visitors from across the continent and beyond. The Zimbabwean government has made it a national monument and a symbol of national identity. The site is managed by the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe, which works to balance conservation with access and to continue the archaeological research that is still revealing new details about the civilization that built it. The challenges facing the site are real. Conservation of dry stone masonry requires ongoing attention. The outer wall of the great enclosure has experienced some deterioration, and stabilization work has been undertaken at various points. The pressure of tourism, particularly in periods when the site attracted large numbers of visitors, has caused wear on the internal areas. Funding for conservation and research has been inconsistent, reflecting the broader economic and political challenges facing Zimbabwe as a country. But the site endures. The walls that were built without mortar, without arches, without the engineering traditions of Europe or the Middle East, have stood for 7 centuries and will likely stand for many more. They are a testament to the skill of the people who built them, to the ambition of the civilization that conceived them, and to the durability of stone as a medium of historical memory. The soapstone birds, those elegant sculptures that once stood in the ritual space of the hill complex, have become the most recognized symbol of this history. The one that appears on Zimbabwe's national flag is a reminder that the history of Great Zimbabwe is not simply the history of a medieval African city. It is the history of a people's relationship with their own past, of the struggle to control the meaning of that past, and of the power of historical memory to shape political identity in the present. What does the full story of Great Zimbabwe teach us? When we step back and look at the whole arc from the early farming villages of the 4th century Common Era to the colonial denial of the 20th century to the national symbol of the 21st. It teaches us that civilization is not the property of any particular region or racial group. It emerges wherever the conditions of geography, trade, political organization, and human ambition align in the right ways. On the Zimbabwe Plateau, those conditions aligned to produce something remarkable. A city of stone, a trading empire, a sacred kingship that lasted for 2 centuries. The people who built it were not exceptional because of their racial identity. They were exceptional because of what they built, and what they built was the product of specific historical circumstances, specific choices, specific skills, and specific ambitions. It also teaches us that the history of civilizations is inseparable from the politics of historical memory. Great Zimbabwe was not simply discovered by European scholars. It was contested, suppressed, misrepresented, and eventually reclaimed. That process of contestation is itself a historical event, as significant in its own way as the original construction of the walls. Understanding Great Zimbabwe fully means understanding both the civilization that built it and the ideological struggle over its meaning, and perhaps most profoundly, it teaches us about the relationship between power and permanence. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe built in stone because they wanted their authority to last. In a literal sense, it did. The walls are still standing. But the political authority they expressed has been gone for 6 centuries. What endured was not the power itself, but the evidence of it, the stone record of a civilization's ambition. And that record, precisely because it endured, became the site of a struggle that the original builders could never have anticipated. A struggle between colonial denial and African historical truth, fought out in the 20th century over stones that were laid in the 14th. The stones won. The truth they encoded, the truth of African civilization, African ambition, and African achievement, proved more durable than the ideology that tried to suppress it. That is not a small thing. In a world where historical memory is often a casualty of political power, the survival of Great Zimbabwe as both a physical site and a historical truth is something worth understanding deeply. If this story moved you, if the history of Great Zimbabwe made you think differently about African civilization, about colonial ideology, or about how we know what we know about the past, please leave a comment below and tell us what struck you most. Subscribe to our channel if you have not already done so. Your subscription is what makes it possible for us to keep producing serious, deeply researched history like this. And it helps other viewers who care about real history find this work. The channel has many more stories waiting for you, stories of civilizations, empires, and peoples whose histories deserve the same careful attention. Open the channel and explore what else is there. The past is vast, and we are just getting started. there is one more dimension of Great Zimbabwe's story that deserves careful attention before we close, and that is the question of what the city looked like and felt like as a living place, not simply as an archaeological site or a political symbol. When the city was at its height, in the 14th and early 15th centuries of the Common Era, it would have been a place of considerable noise, activity, and social complexity. The stone enclosures that survive today were the monumental core, but they were surrounded by a much larger urban landscape of organic, impermanent structures. Thousands of people lived in pole and dagger houses, clustered around the stone walls and spreading outward across the surrounding landscape. Cattle enclosures held the herds that represented the wealth of the ruling class. Workshops produced iron tools, clay pots, and gold objects. Markets, or at least spaces of exchange, brought together people from across the plateau and from the trade routes leading to the coast. The smells of the city would have included wood smoke from cooking fires, the sharp mineral scent of iron smelting, the earthy smell of cattle, and the dust of the dry season. The sounds would have included the clinking of iron tools, the lowing of cattle, the voices of traders negotiating in multiple languages, and the ceremonial drums and singing that accompanied the ritual life of the royal court. This was not a silent ruin. It was a living, breathing, complicated human place. The social life of the city was organized around the principles of Shona kinship and political culture. Extended family groups lived together in clustered compounds. Senior men held authority over their households and owed loyalty upward to their chiefs. Women managed the agricultural work, the pottery, and much of the daily economic activity that kept the city functioning. The division of labor was gendered, but women's economic contributions were substantial and recognized within the social system. The ritual calendar would have structured the year. Ceremonies marking the planting and harvest seasons, ceremonies honoring the ancestors, ceremonies associated with the ruler's sacred status. All of these would have been regular events that brought the population together and reinforced the social and political order. The soapstone birds in the hill complex were not decorative objects. They were participants in a living ritual system, present at ceremonies that connected the ruler to the ancestral spirits who were understood to underpin his authority and the prosperity of the land. The trade goods that arrived from the coast were not simply luxury items for the ruling class, though they certainly served that function. They were also embedded in a system of gift exchange and political relationship. When the Mambo distributed glass beads or cloth to his subordinate chiefs, he was not simply being generous. He was renewing the political bonds that held his authority together. The prestige goods were political instruments, and their distribution was a carefully managed political act. This is why the control of trade was so central to political power. It gave the ruler a monopoly on the most powerful political currency available. The decline of Great Zimbabwe, when it came, would have been experienced differently by different people in the city. For the ruling class, it meant the slow drying up of the trade goods that funded their political relationships, the growing difficulty of maintaining the loyalty of subordinate chiefs, and the rising pressure of environmental degradation around the capital. For ordinary residents, it may have meant increasing difficulty in finding fuel and grazing land, declining agricultural productivity, and the gradual loss of the economic opportunities that the city had provided. The decision to leave, when individuals and families made it, was probably driven by practical necessity as much as by political calculation. The movement of people away from Great Zimbabwe was not a flight from disaster. It was a reorientation toward new centers of opportunity. Some moved northward toward the emerging Mutapa state. Others moved to smaller Zimbabwes across the plateau that continued to function as local political centers. The skills, the traditions, the political culture, and the architectural knowledge that had built Great Zimbabwe dispersed with the people who carried them, seeding new communities and new political formations across the region. This dispersal is part of why the legacy of Great Zimbabwe is so broadly distributed across the plateau. The stone enclosure tradition, the sacred kingship model, the cattle-based political economy, the connection to the Indian Ocean trade network, all of these continued in modified forms in the successor states. The Mutapa state was in many ways a continuation of the Great Zimbabwe political tradition, transplanted to a new location and adapted to new circumstances. The Rosvi state that followed was another iteration of the same basic model. The continuity of political culture across these successive states is one of the most important arguments for understanding Great Zimbabwe not as an isolated phenomenon, but as the foundational moment of a longer tradition of Shona political civilization. The relationship between that tradition and the modern nation of Zimbabwe is complex and worth thinking about carefully. The founders of independent Zimbabwe chose the name and the symbol of Great Zimbabwe deliberately. as a statement that the new nation had deep roots, that it was not simply a colonial creation but the heir to a long and distinguished indigenous history. This was politically important and historically justified. But it also involved a degree of simplification, collapsing a complex and varied history into a single founding symbol. The actual relationship between the medieval civilization of Great Zimbabwe and the diverse peoples of modern Zimbabwe is not straightforward. The Shona people are the largest group in the country and have the strongest cultural and historical connection to the Great Zimbabwe tradition. But Zimbabwe is also home to the Ndebele, to Tonga, Venda, and other communities with their own distinct histories and traditions. The national symbol of Great Zimbabwe is primarily a Shona symbol, and the politics of national identity in Zimbabwe have sometimes reflected the tensions between the Shona majority and other communities. This does not diminish the importance of Great Zimbabwe as a historical site or as a symbol of African civilization. But it is a reminder that historical symbols are always simplifications, always the product of choices about what to emphasize and what to leave aside. The full history of Great Zimbabwe, including its complexity, its connections to broader regional and global systems, and its long afterlife in historical memory and political symbolism, is richer and more interesting than any single national narrative can capture. The ongoing archaeological work at Great Zimbabwe and at related sites across the plateau continues to add new dimensions to our understanding. Researchers are using increasingly sophisticated techniques to extract information from the material record. Isotope analysis of cattle bones to understand herd management and the movement of animals across the landscape, chemical analysis of pottery to trace trade connections, high-resolution mapping of the landscape around the site to identify the full extent of the ancient urban area. Each new study adds detail and nuance to the picture. What is already clear, and what will only become clearer as research continues, is that Great Zimbabwe was not an anomaly. It was not a mysterious exception to some imagined rule of African historical stagnation. It was the product of specific historical processes, of agricultural development, of trade network integration, of political innovation, and of the ambitions of the people who built it. Understanding it fully means placing it in the context of those processes and recognizing it as what it was, one of the great urban civilizations of the medieval world, built by African people, connected to the global trading system of its time, and worthy of the same serious historical attention that we give to any comparable civilization anywhere on Earth. The walls of Great Zimbabwe have outlasted the civilization that built them, the colonial ideology that tried to deny them, and the political struggles that were fought over their meaning. They stand today on the granite plateau of Zimbabwe, weathered by 7 centuries of rain and sun, still impressive, still demanding to be understood. They are a monument not only to the people who built them, but to the enduring human drive to leave something permanent behind, to say in stone what words cannot say across the centuries. We were here, we built this, we mattered. That impulse, to build something that will last, to create a record of human achievement that outlives the individuals and the political systems that produced it, is one of the most recognizable things about the civilization of Great Zimbabwe. It connects the builders of those dry stone walls to every other civilization in human history that has reached for permanence. And the fact that their walls are still standing, still being studied, still inspiring wonder and debate, suggests that in the most fundamental sense they succeeded. If you found this history as compelling as we did, please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. What surprised you most about Great Zimbabwe? What aspect of this story do you think deserves more attention in how we teach and discuss African history? Your comments help build the kind of community that makes serious history worth making. And if you have not yet subscribed to our channel, please do so now. Every subscription helps us continue producing deeply researched, carefully told histories like this one, and helps more viewers discover stories that deserve to be heard. The channel is full of histories waiting for you, from every corner of the world and every era of human experience. Come and explore.